Greetings and welcome to episode 63 of CultureWatch Radio. I'm Mark Ravich and with me is Bill Muhlenberg. G'day to you, Bill.
Hey, always great to be with you.
Likewise. And today we're discussing one of your recent articles, which is entitled 5 Reasons Why Christians Should Confront Non-Christians. So what can you tell me just as an overview about this particular subject?
Yeah, well, I hear it all the time, which is why I wrote this piece. I hear Christians of various stripes telling us, well, you can't really, push your point of view onto non-Christians, or they're not able to understand it or comply, or, there's a million dumb reasons they give, but basically they seem to think that we should kind of just zip the lip, not talk to non-Christians. They don't have the Holy Spirit, so they won't understand. I just kind of boggle my mind when I hear these things being said. It's as if we should just not do anything or say anything, but clearly Christianity is all about sharing. In fact, what I guess really spurred me on was I was reading in the morning of the day from Jeremiah, in verse 5 of Jeremiah 1. God says to Jeremiah, I have appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Now, if God's people are not supposed to be sharing with non-Christians, with pagans and so on, well, then either God got things quite mixed up or he was quite wrong in what he told Jeremiah to do. But the whole of Scripture is about being willing to share truth. Sure, how we do it, right timing, doing it in love, all that has to be brought into consideration, obviously. But this idea that somehow we can't share biblical truth, biblical morality with non-Christians is, well, I just think it's foolish indeed, and it's certainly not very biblical.
Jeremiah, of course, is one of quite a few Old Testament prophets. So how many Old Testament prophets do you think we might have if they were all told that they needed to be winsome and loved by the people and so forth?
Yeah, well, there'd be heaps. Problem is, they'd be what we call false prophets. They're always very popular indeed. The crowds, the masses always love it when the false prophets come along, tell the people what they want to hear, give them sweet platitudes, whisper sweet nothings in their ears, tell them exactly what they want. But if you tell them what God wants and what they need to hear instead of what they want to hear, well, then that's a different ball game altogether, of course. So yeah, basically all the biblical prophets would be non-starters if we just went with this idea of being nice, being nuanced, not rocking the boat, not trying to upset anybody. You wouldn't have the Old Testament prophets at all. Mind you, you wouldn't have Jesus or John the Baptist or the disciples either. So it's a bit of a foolish idea that somehow the nicer we are and the more non-objectionable we are, we're going to somehow win the masses. Well, you'll win the masses, but you'll win them to the wrong side. You'll win them in the wrong direction, and you won't do them a bit of good. So, yes, we need to follow the prophets. And, in fact, if you read the Old Testament carefully, you see just how often they did share, words of rebuke, words of judgment with pagans. In fact, entire books of the Old Testament are devoted solely to pagan nations. Think of, say, the book of Obadiah, which deals with the pagan nation of Edom, or, say, Nahum deals with Assyria, right? So there's plenty of hunks of the other prophets that are directed to the nations. So if God thought it was worthwhile for them to speak to the nations, I think we should be doing it as well. It's foolish not to. We can't leave them in the lurch. We can't leave them hanging. What we have to share is what they need to hear.
Right, so you're touching on something which is of interest to me. The second of your points in the article is that God's laws apply to every single one of us, but I immediately thought of the Ten Commandments, which I suppose is one of the most obvious elements of God's law in the Old Testament, and it was Moses who received them, and wasn't that really just for Israel? So how does it end up that we end up talking to people who haven't received these things? How does that work?
Yeah, well, good question. Obviously, there's more to the law of God in the Old Testament than just the Ten Commandments, but those we would want to kind of, I suppose, run with for obvious reasons. More on that in a moment. But yeah, there's other parts, the ceremonial laws that were meant for ancient Israel. We don't necessarily expect those to be run through today to other nations. There were some civil laws for Israel as a nation, but they no longer, well, they haven't been for a long time. So, there's Christians can debate some of those matters, but what we call the moral law, some of the basic issues of right and wrong, well, it doesn't take much to realize that, any Joe Pagan can fully see the value. In fact, most non-Christian nations have exactly these very laws, right? Laws against theft, laws against murder, right? Laws against lying, and so on. Those are just the basic framework of any civilized society. So just because they happen to be the Ten Commandments doesn't mean we should do away with them, because they were initially given to Moses. In fact, I think it was C.S. Lewis who, in one of his books, went and looked through a lot of the various non-Christian cultures and found that, some of these basic bits of morality are common to all. And you have to ask, if somehow the law of Moses is so inapplicable, why does it seem that all these other nations and cultures have the same thing? There's a universal sense that murder is not good, that lying is not right, that stealing is not a good thing, and there's laws against those things. So in that sense, certainly God's laws are applicable to everyone. And given that he did make us, and given that Jesus seemed to say these laws continue today, and obviously there were more than just Jews who came and followed Christ in the New Testament, so you can see the universal application of God's laws.
And that works well to the third point in your article, which is that in civil society, all laws are based on some sort of morality, and they are intended for all. And you began to talk about road laws, and it's interesting because I was actually talking with someone recently about that very thing, that within a jurisdiction, it makes sense to have an agreement, or I suppose you could say an enforcement of which side of the road everyone should drive on. So, and the simplest reason for that is that you would have collisions all the time if people could just choose which side of the road to drive on given the particular day of the week or time of day or anything like that. So those laws are obviously based, you could draw a definite line from the Ten Commandments in that the sixth commandment upholds life. What would you say about that?
Yeah, well, absolutely. As I say in this piece, if you dig deep enough, scratch long and hard enough, pretty much every law on the books has some kind of moral component, right? As you just said, with the road laws, the idea is to prevent accidents. Why do we want to prevent accidents? Because we value human life. We think we should treat others with respect. And obviously running a red light or ignoring speeding zones and so on, well, that's going to endanger others. So while they may seem arbitrary, and I suppose there's some somewhat arbitrary application, should it be 60 Ks an hour or 70, that's not the point. The point is, what is the moral principle that lies behind it? And this concern for the other person, that's what makes pretty much all of our laws important. One way or another, They deal with various moral issues. And, of course, the critic can complain and say, oh, well, laws can't make you moral. Well, that's true. We're not saying they do. But at least laws can regulate human behavior, right? You may want to run the red light. You may want to go 150 in a 100K zone. But the point is, if it's regulating your behavior for no other reason, for fear of a fine, right, being arrested, that's a good thing because that'll help keep other people safe and it'll save lives. So, again, we're not talking about human laws, government, the state is changing our morality. That's something only the church can do. The church, through Christ, can change the human heart. But what the state does with its various laws is at least control behavior, put a check on some of our selfishness, some of our desires that are often not for the good of others. And that's a good thing. That's about all we can expect from human law. But again, we have to agree that these laws are for the common good. You may not like them, but if they're going to save lives, if they're going to help others, this is a good thing to have. And again, if we dig far enough, a lot of these principles, the moral principles, do go back to, well, surprise, surprise, what we often find in the Ten Commandments.
Yes, I mean, it's not just road laws where I find that connection. The same conversation I had with this person I mentioned also, common currency, being an example of that very thing, where you can draw a line back to the 8th commandment where you're talking about not stealing. Well, why don't we steal? Because property can be legitimately owned in the eyes of God. But being able to, I suppose you could say, deal or exchange things of value with another person, it's not always possible to do barter, and so some common currency needs to be employed. And so how do you do that in such a way that that value is agreed upon, and so that people aren't ripping each other off? And why would ripping off people be wrong? Well, because that's thieving, you know. So as you say, I just find it interesting that you can draw a line to the Ten Commandments with these things, and you can show that there is that moral component. If we look at history as well, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned is that the laws are intended for all. Now, of course, if we wind back the clock or the dates on the calendar all the way to 1215 to the time of King John with how Magna Carta came around, what would you say about that? Because in that particular case, of course, the issue was that King John thought he was above the law.
Yeah, well, again, we can go back to the Judeo-Christian worldview in very practical areas. Here's basic politics, government, the idea of the divine right of kings, the idea that the king was above the law. That was held by many for quite a long time. But as you say, Magna Carta certainly tried to nip that in the bud during the time of the Reformation. Certainly in the English Reformation, that was further developed. The idea of, well, what we call today the rule of law. Everybody is under the law. The king is not above the law. Right. Well, we had Rutherford with his famous Rex Lex, the same idea. Law is king. The king isn't the one who should call the shots. The king himself should be under law. And where does this law come from? Of course, there's a higher standard. There's a law above the law, which even the king himself must submit to. And again, all this comes out of the Judeo-Christian belief that it's God and his morality, his character, that determines what's right and wrong. And if you have a perfect and a holy and a just God, well, laws flowing from him will reflect that. And that means people, whether king or whoever, they too are subject to those laws, and they too should be subject to justice, to righteousness, to not ripping off others, to be held accountable. We could do a whole talk on this one as well, but it's very important, again, flowing directly from things like the Ten Commandments. Everybody is subject to the law. You mentioned some other areas of common, even currency. We could talk about economics. We could do this all night. Marx said the fundamental principle of his system was the abolition of private property. Well, Christianity disagrees, and again, going back, as you said, to the Eighth Commandment, thou shalt not steal. Theft presupposes that you have something which you can hang on to. It presupposes private property. So, again, this idea that Christians can say nothing to non-Christians, well, I think we can say a lot, including to our Marxist friends. Hey, private property is important. It's part of not just the free market, but it's part of what it is for us to be human beings made in God's image, to be just stewards of the gifts he's given us, instead of entrusting a few elites in the state to decide how everything is run and dealt with. Hey, power to the people. Let the people decide within reason. As you say, there's laws against theft, there's laws against various property laws and so on. So again, it all ties together, the way God has arranged things and the way this works itself out in politics, economics, social issues. We have a lot to say as Christians. We shouldn't be ashamed, and we should be willing to speak out and share our point of view.
And this works well into your fourth point, which says this is how a democracy is supposed to function. And I guess what you mean by that is that exchange of ideas, like confronting, say, a Marxist, pointing out the flaws of what they believe, or being able to simply critique or fine-tune ideas. How do you think that this is important to a civil society?
Well, in theory, a democracy allows all voices to be heard. There's always going to be a war of ideas in the public square. Some will win, some will lose, but the ability to make your case, the ability to share your point of view, your values, your beliefs without fear of being, attacked for it, that's what a free and a civil society is supposed to be all about. So the other side obviously does it all the time, right? Whether it's atheists or Marxists or secular humanists, you name it, they're pushing their points of view in the public arena all the time. And, just take any moral issue, right? Take abortion. The pro-aborts are not only pushing their point of view, they're seeking to get laws passed to not only legislate and enforce abortion rights, but actually to punish and deter those who are pro-life. So everybody uses law, or tries to use law, to push their own morality. So this idea that the critics often say, oh, you Christians are just pushing your morality on others. Hey, everybody's doing it every day. People are pushing their morality. The question is, in a free society, we all should have at least the right to share what we think that morality should be. We have the right to vote in politicians, to elect parties to office that reflect our points of view. Again, that's what a free society is all about. So this idea that Christians should somehow just sit down and shut up, that's not biblical. It's certainly anti-democratic. And if the other side is going to keep insisting on it having a voice in public and using the law where it can to coerce others into running with their point of view, well, at least we should have the option to do the same. We should be able to share what we think is important, whether it's pro-life issues, pro-marriage and family, even sharing our religious convictions, sharing the gospel. There should be freedom there, and let the best man win, in a sense. Let our ideas be presented. Let people consider them. They can decide after they've heard pros and cons which way they want to go. But the idea of silencing others, including Christians, or self-censorship, as we started this discussion about. So many Christians who are afraid to speak up. So many Christians think, oh, we're not being tolerant or loving if we try to share our morality, our beliefs. Sorry, that doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, it's interesting, the sharing of ideas. When I read that part of your article, my mind went back to something that happened in World War II, where planes were returning. I think it was American planes, or it might have been British, I can't quite remember, and they noticed a pattern with the parts of the aeroplane which had incurred damage on these planes that were returning, and their intention was to reinforce the planes, the areas of these planes that had been damaged, so that they could continue to fight. And I believe it was a statistician who actually pointed out that actually what they should be doing is reinforcing areas other than these areas that were being damaged, because the planes that weren't returning were most likely getting damaged in those areas, and so therefore they should be the ones that get the attention. And it's interesting, because I think superficially, at first time, sometimes with any discussion, you can think, oh, this is an obvious solution, and then someone can come along and really point out that, oh no, have another look at this, and you might realise that there's actually a better way. And that fine tuning, at the very least, of ideas, you have to have discussion, and you have to have the ability to open it up to everybody. It just seems obvious to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the whole notion of the mainstream media running a narrative, pushing an agenda, I think, unless you're really hardcore left, most people can see this is going on. Social media, the various big tech platforms, you name it. There's so much kind of one-way traffic when it comes to this is what you have to believe, this is the woke gospel, this is the politically correct point of view, and no other points of view will be allowed. Well, that's not how democracy functions. That's how a dictatorship functions. And again, name your issue. It could be climate change. It could be so many different things. The whole lockdown madness that we had with the coronavirus. We tended to get one point of view that was being run with by the elites, by much of the media, by most of our politicians. And unless there is another way to get your point of view across, certainly science doesn't work that way. The idea that science just runs with majority beliefs or never changes, they're open to counter evidence. They're open to challenging the narrative, the paradigm. So science has to function with this kind of give and take of ideas, this ability to question what's the given narrative, and it's the same in every other area of society. So at the very least, Christians should be speaking out, because often we give a point of view, certainly including the spiritual one, that so many others are lacking and they desperately need to hear.
Your last point is that sharing with non-Christians is the most loving thing that we can do. Now, of course, you need to define what you mean by love. So how would you define it, Bill?
Oh, look, I've long said, and not only me, Lewis has said it, many others, but love is really willing the highest good of the other person, right? You want the best for the other person. That's what real love is, not selfishly getting something out of it for yourself, but wishing that they would get the best, whether in terms of what they believe, how they live, what they do. You want the best for that person. So obviously the Christian believes that we have the best, the good news that there is, that we're all heading to a eternal destination, one of two. One's a great place to go, the other is not. In a more humorous vein, there's either a smoking or a non-smoking section of eternity, right? If you love somebody, you want to make sure they're going to be with God forever. not just for the next life, but there's benefits right now to become a Christian, to have a life of purpose, of meaning, of knowing you're loved by God. You were created specifically by God. You're unique. There's nobody else like you. All this is good news. It helps in so many practical ways, right? Suicide is a big problem. Drug abuse, you name it. So if you want to help people, simply giving them the gospel as well as principles of Christian morality, well, that's going to be good for people. Even if they don't themselves become Christians, so many of Christian principles, if more or less run with in a culture, it's going to be good for everybody. Everybody's going to benefit. So in all areas, it's good to want to share the good news of the gospel specifically and of Christian principles in general. That's going to be good for people. And if you love people, you want to give them what's the best.
So finally, what would you say to those who are simply afraid to confront non-Christians and exchange ideas and talk with them? How would you encourage and equip people to be able to share?
Yes, good point. And too many are like this, sadly, and they are afraid. Sometimes it's just fear of man, fear of being rejected, fear of what others will think, fear of rocking the boat. That's all quite common, of course, but again, love overcomes fear. If you really care about others, you want what's best for them, well, come on, it's going to be risky business. Let's make it practical. Let's say your next-door neighbor, you notice, hey, I can smell smoke. I can see flames coming out of the next-door neighbor's house. The most loving thing I can do, obviously, is run straight over there, bang on the door. If I have to kick down the door or smash a window, maybe risk getting the guy offended at first if he doesn't know what's going on. And you might risk your own life and limb, right? Flames and fire. But if you love your neighbor, yeah, it'll come at a cost. It'll be risky, but you want to save him from losing his own life, hopefully help not let the house burn down all the way as well. So come on, this is life. This is caring about neighbor. This is neighbor love. Our commandments are to love God with all our heart, soul, strength, mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So, sorry, we got to move beyond fear. We got to move beyond the stupid worldly ideas that, oh, well, I'm not being very tolerant or I'm not being very loving if I speak out. Sorry, the world has got you in a bind. The most loving thing you can do is to speak out, is to tell truth. And I've written whole articles on yet another example of this, the whole homosexual agenda. Tell a homosexual that, hey, the most loving thing I can tell you, mate, you don't have to be gay if you don't want to be. If you're happy, if you're fine, I'm not pushing you, but if you're uncomfortable, if you're kind of wondering, well, you don't have to be gay. Now, that's good news. That's something they can go back, they can think about, and many people have done just that. I've quoted ex-homosexuals in some of my articles where they were very angry, very mad when Christians would tell them exactly this, right? How dare you? Get out of my life. Get away. I don't want to hear this crap. But deep down, they heard the words and they really considered it. And they said, you're right, I am unhappy with this lifestyle. I'm not really keen to be here. I wish I could find a way out. And many of them did, in turn, get set free from the lifestyle. And then they went and said, thank you. Thank you for telling me this good news. I was angry with you at the time. I wanted you to drop dead at the time. But praise God, you stuck to it. You were brave. You were committed. You loved me enough to confront me, and wow, now I'm eternally grateful. So that's the kind of thing we got to keep in mind. We owe it to others. It'll be costly, it'll be painful, but it's the best thing we can do.
All right, and that's a good note to finish on. Thanks, Bill, for today's episode.
Many thanks.
And there's more on the Culture Watch website. Join us again next time with another episode of Culture Watch Radio.